Well, joining us now from the United Nations is VOA UN correspondent Margaret Besheer. Margaret, you've been covering the UNGA this week. What are your impressions on President Obama's speech? He talked a lot about Arab Spring of rebellion.
Well, I think really, Vincent, the Arab Spring, Libya in particular, very big issue here this week. Also, of course, the Palestinian statehood has really overshadowed everything here. But in his speech on the Arab Spring and on African nations, he touched on South Sudan, as Kent mentioned in his piece. He was very positive, I thought, on South Sudan. He didn't mention the violence that we've seen since independence, the violence in southern Kordofan and Blue Nile. He didn't mention that apparently until later in the day. He met with southern Sudanese President Salva Kiir. They had a one-on-one meeting, and President Obama's advisors say that that issue came up and that he called on Salva Kiir to take action on reports that the South Sudanese military is providing support to fighters there.
Now, clearly, the president actually told the Palestinians clearly that they shouldn't expect a resolution to their conflict at the UN. Then what role do we expect the UN to have in moving forward certain developments in Africa, African countries, Libya, Egypt, Ivory Coast, South Sudan, and so on?
Well, I think it's apples and oranges when you're talking about the Palestinian issue, because that's a statehood issue. It's a UN membership issue. It's not something where you send a peacekeeping mission or a humanitarian mission to solve it. It's a much more political issue. So that's, you know, I don't think we can compare that with Africa. The UN is doing a lot of work in Africa. One of the things President Obama mentioned in his speech is Libya. And we know certainly that last week the UN Security Council authorized a mission, a political support mission, not a peacekeeping mission, to deploy to Libya about 200 UN personnel. And they're going to help with things like institution building, transitional justice, human rights. Because, you know, Libya was under a dictator for 42 years, and the country doesn't really have state institutions. So now they have to start from scratch. But they're lucky because they're a wealthy country. They have the oil money. The resolution that was authorized last week also is going to unfreeze some of the assets, the Libyan assets that were frozen in the past 6 months in order to put pressure on Mr. Gaddafi to stop his violence against his citizens. So the UN is very active on Libya. Ian Martin will be going out. He was the post-conflict planning person on Libya. He's now going to be the special envoy for Libya, the SRSG in Libya. So no, there's going to be a lot of action from the UN on Libya, certainly. And Ivory Coast, too. We heard President Obama talk about the landmark elections last year in Ivory Coast, the violence that followed when Mr. Gbagbo wouldn't leave, and now, you know, how the international community stood behind Mr. Ouattara, the true democratically elected leader, and now he's, you know, in office and starting to get his administration going. So the UN is still there. UNOC is the mission that's there, and it's going to stay to support the new government until it's stable. This weekend, we're going to have a news conference with Mr. Ouattara, so perhaps he'll tell us a bit more about the reconciliation process and the plans for elections. Yeah,
now, briefly, we know there are other things happening in Africa. There is that drought and famine in the Horn of Africa. Tell us, are there any discussions that are expected on this issue?
On Friday afternoon, we're going to have a high-level meeting on Somalia, and that's expected to focus on the famine issue. It's been very severe in Somalia, as you know, and it's not a donors meeting, but it's going to be a meeting to see what the international community can do further to mobilize and help stop this crisis. But you know what? We're not having a meeting on Sudan this year, and we did last year a special sideline meeting because the referendum was coming. But it's a shame because I think that they really do need to discuss it because of the violence in Blue Nile and South Kordofan.
Margaret, I hope they can listen to you and do exactly that. Thanks a lot, Margaret.
Thanks, Vincent.
Thanks a lot for your insights. Margaret Besheer, VOA's UN correspondent in New York.